Hello everyone, so my name is Nick Janicki and I'm an academic tutor on the MSc in Security and Risk Management course within the Criminology department. So the session that I will be leading at the Study School event is titled Using an Ethical Framework to Develop Your Research Ideas and Methodology. The reason why we decided to do a workshop on this topic is because we've found over the years that our students can sometimes struggle to apply ethics to their dissertation. Our distance learning students tend to have fantastic opportunities to enter very closed research sites such as certain organisations or populations, which can create a number of complex ethical issues that they need to consider. However, through my experience, students can sometimes view ethics as being an add-on to their research and also a little bit of a hindrance. However, the correct approach to view ethics is that it is central throughout the whole of the research process, and in fact, through embedding ethics in this way, it will actually enhance your research rather than be a hindrance. This will be also beneficial because when you come to complete your university ethics application, you will have already considered a number, if not all, of the questions that are posed within that document, and you've had an opportunity to discuss them with your dissertation supervisor. Therefore, they are fully embedded within your research design. If that is not the case and you only decide to consider ethics at the stage of completing that application, it can sometimes result in you not fully being able to answer some of those questions and subsequently having to go back and think about ethics, consider certain safeguards, and then map that on to your research design or possibly change your research focus, which not only creates more work for yourselves, but also can create further delay. So by the end of this lecture and the group session at Study School, it is hoped that you will have an improved understanding and knowledge of how ethics relates to the whole research process. It's also hoped that you'll gain an understanding of the 4 key ethical dimensions that underpin the ethical appraisal framework, which I will discuss during this lecture. A lot of you will probably be already familiar with 2 of those dimensions because they are built on 2 key moral theories, consequentialism and the ontological. However, there are 2 other dimensions as well within the framework, which include ecological and relational, which I will discuss in some detail during this lecture. It is also hoped that by the end of this lecture and the group session, that you'll be able to apply the ethical appraisal framework to your dissertation. The framework that I will be using during this session was developed by Chris Stutchbury and Alison Fox, with Alison actually previously working within the Department of Education within the university. Through their work, they built on the reports of other academics such as David Seedhouse and David Flinders and produced a framework or tool that researchers can use to appraise their own research. The framework or tool is not formulaic in the sense of you answer a number of questions and it tells you what ethical measures or safeguards you should put in place. Rather, it is used as a guide, so it gets you to think about key ethical issues at specific points within your research or ask yourself certain questions, so then you can arrive at defensible and transparent decisions which have a moral basis. This is particularly important because within your dissertation you will have to justify why you have made certain decisions, and also if you are asked by others, you are able to give a solid, credible and moral argument to defend why you've done certain things or made certain decisions. And finally, as well, it's hoped that you will have developed some skills to appraise research ideas and data collection methods. This will include your own research ideas and collection methods, because within your dissertation you'll have to show some reflexivity, so you'll have to recognise some of the potential weaknesses or limitations within your research. Also, through understanding this framework, it may give you further insight into how you can analyse or critique other forms of research as well, which can enhance your critical analysis within your dissertation, such as within your literature review chapter. So the first dimension of the ethical appraisal framework very much centres on the early stages of your research when you are developing your research focus. The key question you should be asking yourselves here is my research worthwhile? This question very neatly aligns with the consequentialist and utilitarian perspective, which is based on the premise that the rightness or wrongness of decisions or actions can be judged based solely on the outcome. Therefore, during these early stages, you should be thinking about what contribution your research could make. One contribution it should clearly make is to academia, given that you are undertaking a postgraduate degree. The kind of contribution it could make to academia is by enhancing knowledge. So it may be that your research has an empirical contribution because it will explore a topic that has not been fully considered, and so it will generate new knowledge and data. In addition, it may be that your research has a methodological contribution. So it could be that the topic that you want to look at has been researched extensively, however, it has not used certain types of methodology which you will opt to undertake. Thirdly, it could have a theoretical contribution as well. However, this level of contribution tends to be linked more closely with the PhD level research. So at this stage, in order to find out what kind of academic contribution your research will make, it's really important that you undertake a preliminary review of the literature to see what we already know about the topic area that you want to focus on, as well as what the possible gaps could be within the existing knowledge that your research could fill. You also need to consider who else will benefit from your research. It could be that your research will benefit individuals such as your participants. It may be that your participants have a certain perspective or voice that has not been heard, and so through bringing that to the surface, it may be that you can develop or you can establish some findings that could prompt some positive change with these individuals, their lives, activities, or individuals that are related to them. Your research may comprise of you entering a certain organisation, and so the findings from your research may make positive changes to policy and practice, which will have a positive impact on how that organisation functions in the future. A third possible benefit may be to society or the greater good. An example of this may be that your research will reveal certain mechanisms of inequality or oppression that exist within society, and so bringing these to the surface and making others aware of them could again result in positive change or a programme of change. And finally, it could have a benefit to you as a researcher. One clear benefit is that through completing your dissertation successfully is that you will be awarded a degree. Also, it may be that you want to choose a certain topic that could enhance your professional development as well. So whilst it is important to establish these benefits at the beginning of the research process so you can construct a credible rationale for your research, it's also important to consider the possible risks that could be present if you were to pursue your ideas. It may be that some of the risks relate to your participants, and that the topic that you want to explore could result in them having to reveal certain sensitive experiences, memories, etc., that could cause distress. Your research may also involve collecting data from those who are considered vulnerable, and so there may be more risks attached to this group of individuals, or the threshold for creating harm could be lower. The organisation that you enter to conduct your research could have certain deficits or deficiencies, and your research may reveal them, that could result in other people knowing about these deficits or deficiencies and subsequently have a negative impact on the organisation's reputation and identity. And finally, there may be risks to yourselves, such as safety issues. A number of our distance learning students conduct their research within hostile environments, and so there's a number of health and safety conditions that need to be taken into account. So at this early stage of your research, if you are able to consider some of these risks, then it may be that through discussions with your dissertation supervisor, you can put certain ethical safeguards or measures in place later within your research, such as within your methodology. However, it may be that some of these risks are too big, or you cannot negotiate them by putting specific safeguards in place, so you may have to change the focus slightly. So you are still able to achieve the benefits. So the second dimension very much focuses on your research approach, with the key question here being, am I a responsible researcher? This dimension is underpinned by the ecological or external perspective, which consists of you having to consider what type of expectations or obligations may be placed on you from certain individuals, bodies, or organisations throughout your research. A number of bodies that you need to take into account have been listed on this slide. So the first will be the institution, i.e. the University of Leicester. As I've mentioned previously, all of you will have to complete the university ethics approval process, and so that will be an obligation placed on yourselves as researchers. Also, when conducting your research, you need to bear in mind that you are doing this in the name of the University of Leicester. So if you were to behave irresponsibly during your research, then it could have a negative impact on the university's reputation. Alternatively, if you are irresponsible when conducting your research, it may have a negative effect upon future students or other academics wanting to access that research site, which will have a further implication on the development of academic knowledge within that discipline or area. A further body that you may need to take into account is the organisation that is involved within your research. Each organisation or research site will function differently, and it's important that you get an understanding of how that site works. One example is that within criminal justice institutions, it is often that they have an expectation that if you are interviewing clients or offenders, that if they disclose behaviour or an offence that has not been reported to the police, that you then have to share that with the relevant agencies. Again, this will be something that the researcher would have to take into account through their research process, and this very much relates as well to the next dimension. It may be that some of you have sponsors and there's certain conditions attached to this sponsorship, such as having to complete your research by a certain date. There are codes of ethics or practice on a local, national, and even international level that you will need to take into account as researchers. For example, within the criminology department, we align with the code of practice outlined by the British Society of Criminology. There's also legal obligations that you will have to take into consideration, such as the Data Protection Act and more recently GDPR, and so researchers will have to build this into their research design. This legislation very much governs how researchers should collect, manage, and even destroy their data. So it's important that researchers comply with all the relevant principles and elements of that legislation. Also, more recently, the contest strategy has had an impact on research conducted within the UK, and those that want to undertake research that is related to terrorism or radicalisation need to undertake a further risk assessment. And again, if that relates to you, that is something that you would have to discuss with your dissertation supervisor. There will also be cultural sensitivities. The research site that you enter will have certain norms, values, and even deviations or differences within the use of language, and so you need to take this into consideration when conducting your research. For instance, if you are undertaking interviews within a certain research site, then you need to be very clear about the use of language and that your participants will understand the questions that you're asking them, but also that there is a lack of ambiguity behind those questions as well. It may also be that you need to consider how you are viewed as a researcher when entering your research site. Some organisations or sites may be suspicious towards those who do enter it who are not known, or researchers specifically. So you need to think about what measures you can put in place to ensure that you are responsive to this. The third dimension relates to your methodology and the data collection processes involved within your research, with the key question here being, am I a respectful researcher? The ethical perspective underpinning this dimension are those related to relational and duty of care ethics. This perspective very much enables you or asks you to think about those who you will develop relationships with through your research and how you can do that in a caring, supportive and respectful manner. On this slide, there are a number of factors that you need to consider within this dimension. However, they are very research specific, and so you will need to discuss these with your dissertation supervisor. However, I will give some examples of how they may apply to research, both quantitative and qualitative research. The first factor is the establishment of trust. So within this point, you need to really think about key stakeholders that you will need to develop a constructive relationship with, such as your gatekeeper and your participants. If I take a moment to first discuss your gatekeeper, this individual is very key for your research and is the one who can give you approval to access your research site, be that a certain organisation, professional association, or group of individuals. So the establishment of trust with this individual will very much start from how you approach them and the subsequent negotiations that you are involved with your gatekeeper. They will have certain expectations or requirements that they may want you to take into consideration. So it's important that you do that as well as fulfill them fully throughout the whole of your research. One specific condition they may have may be about anonymity, and so you need to bear this in mind when not only collecting your data but also how you analyse and report it. If you are undertaking empirical research, the second group of individuals that you'll have to establish a trusting relationship with are your participants. Whether you're doing quantitative or qualitative research, the start of this constructive relationship will very much be based on how you approach these individuals and possibly recruit them to be involved within your research. From then, there are different ways in which trust can be developed, which are very much centred or specific to your methodology. So, for instance, if you are undertaking quantitative research and want to collect data through using an online survey, you need to ensure that the information within your consent form is very clear and the participants can understand what your research is about, as well as the procedures that will impact them. Furthermore, you need to make sure that your questionnaire is constructed efficiently and also that it aligns with your information and consent form. If your participants feel that certain questions are unjustified, or they are suspicious of why you're asking certain questions of them or want certain information, that may create distrust, and subsequently they may want to withdraw or step back from your research. With this data collection method, you are not present, and so you are not able to explain to them why you may be asking certain questions. And so you need to make sure that your questionnaire is structured very efficiently, and it may be that undertaking a pilot study can help with this. Alternatively, if you're undertaking qualitative research, because you will have face-to-face interaction with your participants. So with this in mind, you need to consider how you will ask certain questions, but also how you will respond to your participants in your verbal and non-verbal communication. It may also be that you need to re-establish certain requirements or ethical conditions to them throughout the interview or focus group, such as those of confidentiality. The second point to consider within this dimension relates to increasing autonomy and self-determination. This is a key cornerstone of ethics within the social science research. It centres around the obtaining of informed consent and the fact that this consent is also of a voluntary nature. Again, if I start with the notion of informed consent, this has two aspects. The first being that the participants are fully aware of what you are doing, why you're doing it, and also the procedures that will impact on them. Secondly, they need to give consent, so they need to approve to being involved within their research. But also as well, you need to ensure that your participants have the capacity as well to give consent. The second point relates to the consent being of a voluntary nature. The most prevalent issue that relates to our distance learning students is that they can often have a dual role, whereby they work within the organisation that they are conducting their research. During these situations, it may be that the researcher's position as a colleague or manager can cause subtle forms of coercion, pressure, or obligation upon potential participants. Therefore, you need to take into consideration how you may be able to recruit your participants differently, or that you may need to use a different sample population when conducting your research. The third point relates to empowering your participants. Research involves power dynamics, and it can result in individuals feeling either empowered or disempowered. The way it can make individuals feel disempowered is if they feel as though they are being objectified during the research process, and so that they are being used for their knowledge, experience, etc., and that they feel that they're not contributing in any way or will get any benefit from being involved within the process. One way to overcome this may be around using co-production, and this is particularly relevant to qualitative research, whereby researchers involve the participants a lot more collaboratively within the production of knowledge, but also within the analysis and the writing phase of the research. A category of research that aligns very neatly with this notion is that of participatory action research. Adopting this type of design comprises of the researcher involving participants through the whole of the research process, so it consists of participants potentially being involved in the identification of a relevant subject area, the generation of the data, but then also how the findings are used in developing a programme of change, as opposed to the researcher in a didactic form telling them what the findings are and how they should be used. It's very much filtered into a collaborative process whereby the researcher and relevant stakeholders can develop a certain strategy or certain actions of how the findings can be taken into consideration. The fourth point refers to promoting equality, and this centres very much around fair representation of individuals or groups within your research. Therefore, when undertaking your research, particularly considering your sampling strategy, you need to think about the type of individuals that will be involved, the groups that will be involved, and the reasons for this, and to also ensure that certain individuals are not excluded for unnecessary reasons. The fifth point relates to the reduction of harm, both short and long term. And this very much relates to the risk of potential distress, emotional, psychological, or physical harm to your participants as well as yourself. So, when planning your research design and data collection methods, you need to think about and anticipate the possible harm that could be caused to your participants and yourself, as well as the specific measures or safeguards that might have to be put in place to minimise this. An example being that if you're undertaking interviews or focus groups, that you may have to think about the type of questions that are asked and how they are worded. So you may have to change your focus slightly to ensure that you do not ask participants specifically around certain negative experiences that they may feel uncomfortable to discuss. Alternatively, it may be that the support that you can offer to your participants is limited, and so you need to find out other sources of support that you can inform them of should they need to access it. It may be that your research is of a sensitive nature, and so you may want to be more explicit about this within your information and consent form, and inform your participants that there may be a higher risk of distress during the data collection process. However, that they may be able to exit or terminate the interview or focus group at any point should they want to. The final point relates to reducing imposition to the research site and organisation involved in your research. As I've mentioned previously, a number of you may be adopting a dual role through the research process, and this can be an advantage because you will have a fuller understanding of how your research site or organisation functions, and so you can construct a research design and data collection method that involves least imposition to either colleagues, managers, etc. The final dimension relates to research obligations, with the key question here being, am I doing it right? This aligns very closely to the deontological perspective, which centres around the possible duties that you will have as a researcher and which you have to embed within your research process. A number of these have already been discussed within the previous dimensions, and so you will already have considered how you can ensure that your duties are maintained as a researcher. The first point is about being open and honest during the research process, and this has been discussed within the previous dimension and can relate to, for instance, being open with your participants about what the research is about, the procedures followed, etc., but also as well what the possible limits are in what you can promise them or what you can provide during your research. An example may be that if you are undertaking an online survey that does not require participants to give any personal details, is that you cannot provide them with the right to withdraw after they have submitted their questionnaire. While you can justify this decision on the ethical grounds that you are providing complete anonymity, the fact is that you need to be open and honest with your participants about this so they can make, again, an informed decision as to whether they want to pursue or continue with your research or not. The second point is about avoiding coercion and deception, and this can link quite closely to the dual role which we have discussed within the previous section. The third point relates to avoiding harm, which has been discussed within the previous dimension. However, you also need to take a more holistic view when considering possible harm through thinking about if there is a risk of harm to others after you have written, submitted, and possibly even published your research. The fourth point relates to fairness and dignity in making sure that you treat all participants fairly throughout the whole of the research process. And the final point is focused on keeping promises. So if, for instance, you have told participants that you will uphold the right of anonymity and confidentiality, then you need to make sure that you follow that throughout the whole of your research, in particular the writing stage. The university ethics application that you will have to complete before you can conduct your research and collect your data will address all of these areas, and so you really do need to think about them before you complete your application. So, arriving at a brief conclusion, we have considered how ethics should be viewed throughout the whole of the research process. We've talked about how you can make ethically sound and justified decisions at each stage of the research process, but also how you can use various ethical perspectives to underpin your decision making. Also, a very strong theme through this lecture is that researchers do not work in isolation, and various other actors are involved within your research, which can range from participants through to future researchers, which you need to take into account. Also, we've considered the various ways in which you can appraise your dissertation through an ethical lens, and how this can actually enhance your research and the outcome. However, as highlighted through this lecture, ethics are very context specific, and so I've not been able to discuss all the different decisions and permutations of ethics and measures that can be put in place, and so you need to have a detailed discussion with your dissertation supervisor about your research and how you can ensure it is ethically sound. And finally, there's a reference list and some sources should you want to read prior to the study school session. And I will see you all at the session at Leicester.